Hello and welcome back to the Bitcoin Bridge. Tonight we're going to go straight into the middle of the Pacific to Tuvalu, in fact. We're going to talk to George Siosi Samuels, who is the founder of FAIA, and he's also been leading the Tuvalu National Digital Ledger Project, which is something that everyone in Bitcoin BSV has been pretty interested about. I'm going to let George do the talking, so over to him, and stay tuned. George Siosi Samuels, welcome to the Bitcoin Bridge.
How's it going? Pleasure to be here.
You're actually in Mexico at the moment, right?
That is correct. Yeah, I've been here since about October, but usually I'm based in Singapore.
Excellent. Now, I want to talk to you today about FAIA, and I want to talk to you about the Tuvalu project, because I think that's something that's really captured the imagination of everyone in Bitcoin BSV recently. We spoke to Brendan Lee about it a few weeks ago, and he gave us a brief rundown, but he also recommended that we talk to you in a little bit more detail. So that's what I'm going to let you do today. We also have some questions that we got on Twitter that people from the community wanted to ask you. I guess the first thing I want to ask is, how's it going at FAIA? And could you just tell us a little bit about your role there?
Sure thing. So I am the managing director for FAIA. It's a company I set up 3 years ago, so in 2018. And interestingly enough, had just put out an article talking about sort of the evolution of the company from those early days. When I originally set it up in terms of like the formation of the idea for FAIA, we were actually looking at enterprises. We were looking at sort of doing technology adoption work for corporates and enterprise, because that's what I was involved in previously. And the Bitcoin aspect, I think, came a little bit later when we actually formed the company in Singapore. And at the time, because it was 2018, it was just a year after the whole ICO craze. There was a lot more, I think, demand for blockchain crypto marketing services. Of course, because I've always been following sort of the original Bitcoin. We had a bit of those services, but the original intent, I would say it's taken about 3 years for us to get back into that space of what was originally intended for FAIA. And that probably leads into the Tuvalu project.
What's the primary role you see for FAIA? I know you talk about building bridges and communities, that kind of thing, but what specifically does that involve?
So one of the things that we've noticed, so I'll go back to sort of the original intent and for the company itself. So when I was working in the corporate space, what we noticed was many companies, whenever they decided to incorporate new technologies, and I'm just talking internally, right? And now these companies, of course, they're dealing with thousands of employees. Whenever they incorporate any new technologies, the IT departments that head up the sort of rollouts, they often look at the technology as just a switch with their people, right? So a salesperson would come to them, maybe the CTO or something, just sell it to them, convince them. They'll do some sort of scoping and analysis of all the products, checking the boxes between pros and cons. And then usually they'll just go with the cheapest product, right? And then they would just roll it out to everybody and expect everybody to just get it. Now, the issue is on the people side, a lot of these products end up not being leveraged or utilized as much as it could be if they had thought about sort of the cultural aspects. And this is something that I saw time and time again. And this is why you'll probably see why I, and even through FAIA, will talk about the importance of people in technology adoption. Understanding these cultural nuances is what actually helps with the adoption of technology. And when it comes to technology, if you negate that, you actually shoot yourself in the foot, because you're thinking that superior technology will just win at the end of the day. But when it comes to people and technology adoption, it's everything that's here that prevents people from adopting technology easily. And so the role that we play is coming from that people cultural element. I think we've been playing around with sort of what is our pitch over the years. And I think this has been reflected in sort of how some people have been like, what does FAIA actually do? And to be honest, for us, we were, I think, finding our niche area as well, because we went from sort of like marketing services and now into these government projects. But I think the thing that has always been consistent has been that bit, about helping to improve the technology adoption, whether it was with internal teams and employees, or now even at a government level, or even for startups with the adoption of their own products with their audiences and communities.
When you say culture, are you talking more about business culture and corporate cultures and the differences and subtleties
Correct.
involved there? Not so much national
Correct.
cultures, maybe.
No, but there are similarities, right? So This is the thing. I think people often see them as separate, whereas for me, I see it all as all the same. When you have a group of people, regardless of whether it is business or national or non-business, cultures form. And so the difference is, I think, because we've become so disconnected from maybe our general civic neighborhoods, right? When people would talk about communities, you'd often think about, your civic neighborhood communities, right? But with the advent of the internet and everybody going borderless, a whole bunch of online communities have become the norm. And I can tell you that even because I've been a community manager in the past, there are now more investors looking specifically at community-driven ventures. Mm-hmm. And I think, who was it? There was an investment by HubSpot recently for a group called Trends.co, right? And so this Trends.co group was an online community, and they got purchased and acquired by HubSpot, right? So if people don't see this yet, essentially what's happening is those who are able to build trust and loyalty through these groups, even if they don't necessarily have a product, that is becoming very valuable now for all of these tech giants. Reddit, you saw what happened with GameStop recently. Those subreddits are communities, and they can have huge sways now on markets. And so there's been increased interest in investors in these community groups.
And increased fear as well, I think, in some cases.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yin and yang, right? Both sides.
Yeah. For the first 20 years of the internet, it was like, wow, this technology is powerful for building communities. And since then, it's been, oh, wow, this technology is really powerful for building communities. We may not actually like
Exactly. No, exactly. And I do always try to keep that balance in mind because I know in the Bitcoin space, people can talk about the power of the crowds and the power of the collectives, but you can also look at the stupidity of crowds and the stupidity of collectives. But I think for human beings, you will always have both present. Yeah. It's just that at any point in time, one may be larger than the other.
Alrighty then. Well, I think culture is very central to the Tuvalu project that you've been working on. It's called the Tuvalu National Digital Ledger, if I'm correct there.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about what that is, more maybe what it isn't, and how did that come about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I'll start off with how it originally came about. So there was, it was New Year's Eve actually. It was 2019. Yeah, the New Year's Eve of 2019, and I was with my godmother in Australia, and we were it was a very casual, quiet New Year's Eve. Nothing too wild, and we were chatting together about things that have been happening in Tuvalu. And so she told me how she heard news from our relatives that Tuvalu was going to renew something to do with .tv. Mm-hmm. Now she's not very technical, but she knew a little bit about what .tv meant to Tuvalu in terms of revenue. And so I was like, oh, interesting. Tell me more. And then she was telling me, and I was looking at sort of the revenue that they've been getting and what they could be getting from the new deal. And I said, wow, this is crazy. Like, this is actually a massive opportunity for Tuvaluans. And, why don't more people know about it? So then I started doing some research, and this is all happening in that same midnight session, right? Yeah. While I'm talking to her, I'm looking it up on Google. And then I just got this spark of inspiration, combining sort of everything I've been doing over the last, I guess, decade. To do with communities, Bitcoin, tech adoption, etc. And I literally wrote out a 5-point plan. So there's a Medium article, which we can attach to the show notes or something. Mm-hmm. Which I've read, yes. A 5-point plan to help improve things for the sinking nation of Tuvalu. Mm-hmm. And mind you, for those listening, Tuvaluans don't necessarily like the sinking nation name. And hence why they want to sort of start to change the narrative around that.
Yeah. When you say sinking, you mean literally sinking, right? Not economically.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. It's a very
Correct.
low-lying country.
So literally sinking.
Yeah.
There are very few mountains there. And the wild bit is that, like, so I have Tuvaluan heritage, right, and ancestry, but I have not yet set foot in Tuvalu, right? For most of my life, I've kind of been a nomad in living in different countries. But luckily, my mother has always kept us grounded in our roots. And so I was always fascinated by our own culture, our own history. And of course, I've got my families and relatives. But I really saw this as a way of taking advantage of the fact that my parents, moved overseas for a better life, to give us a better education. And probably the biggest honor that I could have in this lifetime is to use that to give back. And so that was kind of all that was going into that article when I wrote it. And it just came out so clearly. And I literally just hit publish that night. And next thing I know, it gets circulated, like wildfire with the Tuvaluan community. And it landed in the hands of a Tuvaluan government official, who then made an introduction to the Minister of Justice, Foreign Affairs and Communications, Simon Kofe. And so when that happened, that sort of sparked the initial discussions. It was a very slow process, but he was very good at taking the time to understand all the technology. And so, yeah, we ended up having, conversations after conversations. I laid out to him sort of the differences as well between, BTC, BCH, and BSV, so that he was well aware, right, of like why I am advocating for use of something like BSV. And he was on board with that. And one thing that I kind of learned later on was that the reason why someone like Simon Kofe was able to understand what we were doing was he's actually used to making pretty big, bold moves against things that most people would be like, oh, why didn't you just take the money? So for an example, I learned later on as we were working together that Simon had actually rejected $400 million from China to create floating cities. Right.
Interesting.
Knowing that Tuvalu has, is potentially, sinking. Right. You think, oh, you're stupid to not take that money. Right. But as you start digging into the South Pacific more, you realize actually how strategic it is economically, geographically, between a lot of the superpowers. And so
of course, yes.
This then started to really make me a lot more interested in the Pacific region.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go.
I was going to say we should say where Tuvalu is located. It's somewhere near Australia or New Zealand in the South Pacific. So you just imagine.
So it's in the South Pacific. Yep. So the way I usually describe for people, it's between Hawaii and Fiji, or New Zealand if you don't know where Fiji is, and it's also close to Samoa and Tonga. So Samoa, if everybody knows who The Rock is, Dwayne Johnson. And if you've seen Fast and the Furious 7, I believe, that's essentially the part of the South Pacific that Tuvalu is also located.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll put up a map and show everyone exactly where that is, so they can get a more visual idea of it. Okay.
Definitely.
I've got some questions here from Twitter, and I don't want to disappoint anyone by not including their questions. So if it's okay, I wouldn't mind just asking them directly to you. Some of them are quite basic. What are you actually going to do? So
is that the question?
Yeah, from building on Bitcoin SV, they said, what are the priority use cases you're considering to improve life for people of Tuvalu, community, government, business owners, and consumers? So I think that's probably a good general one to start with. What are you actually going to be building?
Yep. So the first has to do with essentially government services. So they are already in the process of sort of, a wider digital transformation effort. And many governments are, currently in the process of their own sort of digital transformation projects. And using something like BSV as part of that, they saw as a good fit, a good connection. Because they're looking to, of course, they're at a point in the nation's history where they're able to make the moves to improve their infrastructure, right? And so improving their digital infrastructure is a big part of that. So at the same time, they are improving things like their wireless networks, mobile networks, etc. They do already have 3G, but upgrading to 4G, potentially 5G, is currently underway. And from the BSV side, it's about actually looking at, okay, well, from a sort of central ID standpoint, which I think this is being talked about a lot in the Bitcoin ecosystem and for many other blockchain projects, but it's actually starting to implement that for a nation like Tuvalu. And the beginning phase is looking at things like their citizenship applications. So that's something that we are starting with, and for the more advanced, longer term, of course, it's looking at the cash system aspect. Now, I can't go into too much detail on that or give any timelines or whatnot, but that is, of course, part of the plan. And I've done a bit of research on other projects that have happened in the region, and for the most part, people are using blockchain cryptocurrency still more like as a way of fundraising, and not necessarily for day-to-day transactions, and or even the embedding of data in those transactions. So it's very interesting, to see how some people are utilizing blockchain technology for on-the-ground stuff. The World Bank, is it the World Bank? I think it's the World Bank. I believe they did some work in Vanuatu, which is an interesting one if you just want to research.
Yeah.
Where I think they leverage Ethereum and the consortium or consensus group to do some stuff relating to emergency aid relief. I don't know if you heard about that by any chance, John?
I didn't hear about that one specifically, but I'm familiar with Vanuatu being more, well, it at least tried to be a financial services center for the South Pacific in that region at one point.
Yes.
I'm not sure how.
Yep.
Whether that is still going or not. It's in a similar.
Well,
region.
yeah. So actually, So as a result of them sort of taking a little bit more of a stand on the digital transformation part, I believe I think this was announced in December, but I think they've come out of being like a third world nation or developed nation. Hold on, let me just quickly take a look. I think I just put this up on Twitter. Let me see if I can find it. Not too many things on my Twitter, but I think I was talking to Alex from Handcash about this in that same thread, and yeah, essentially Vanuatu has been able to move from being an underdeveloped nation and moving itself up into its next stage, which is very good and very promising.
Tuvalu's famous mainly for its, as you mentioned before, the .tv top-level domain, which has been popular with TV networks, TV production companies, that kind of thing. But I think you mentioned this in your original article. They were not getting such a hot deal from that. So people always assume that they must be making bank from selling that domain, but they don't sell it directly. It's part of a partnership that they do with a private company, if I understand that correctly. How can you improve that?
That is correct. Yeah. So this is common, and I often hear news about this. I guess just having lived overseas, right? The news that we do hear about what's happening in the South Pacific. Generally, you'll hear about the South Pacific almost selling their rights or underselling themselves when it comes to these sort of deals. And I think that's one of the things that frustrates me the most, which is why I'm interested in sort of like going back and doing my best to not only assist but educate and help like get better deals for themselves. Because I think from what I'm seeing, there is a lot of untapped potential and economic value for the Pacific region and all of those nations. I only recently learned about the EEZ, the exclusive economic zones that the South Pacific hold. And if you look at that, their essential like economic territory, in terms of the South Pacific, the oceans, is larger than I think Russia, right? So now you go from these small island nations to, if they learn to combine themselves, could be a very lucrative market. And so this is where I'm thinking ahead, and looking at, how to sort of tap into that so that the islands themselves can be more self-sufficient, less dependent on foreign aid, etc.
What do you go?
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Don't know if I answered your question. I think I went off on a tangent.
You did, yeah. We were talking about the .tv top level domain specifically.
.tv, thank you. Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Yeah, having a natural resource or a valuable natural commodity, I think it's always been regarded as a blessing and a curse for any country, really. If you've got oil, you're going to make a lot more money from it. You're going to have a lot more problems for it. More money, more problems.
Yep.
As they say.
Exactly.
Do you think the .tv domain has been a good thing for Tuvalu?
I do believe it has, because it's provided an extra revenue source for them that they might not have otherwise had. Noting that, of course, their physical resources, they've been very dependent on, their fisheries industry. And that has a limitation as well, infrastructure-wise. Their location has been considered a disadvantage, but now that, more and more people are moving to remote, now it can become their strength.
Yeah,
and as we have more people
now.
moving online, and with more people moving online, and this knowledge economy, I think if they can learn how to tap into that more and more, they will find new ways. So they essentially have very good, they're very fortunate, to have something like .tv to be able to leverage off of. And I think that should be able to help provide them with an income source that they can then not only generate revenue, but then also feed that back into physical infrastructure projects.
That's good. Yeah. What do you see as the top priority? Like if you had to wow people with one key use case for the Bitcoin blockchain in Tuvalu, what would you do? And I take it this is what you are going to do.
Yeah. How much to share?
In other words, where do you start?
Okay, so I can touch on. Yeah, of course. I think if Tuvalu, in terms of transactions, right, with a population of between 11 to 13,000, you could have a nation of Tuvalu roll out essentially a cash system that leverages BSV for everything.
Really?
This is one of the benefits of a place like Tuvalu, that it's small enough for it to replace everything. A lot of people on the islands, they have mobile phones, right? So they're familiar with that. And, imagining, if they're all able to get something like hand cash, and if you get all of the merchants that are there in the islands to essentially accept, say, BSV as maybe even legal tender for the nation of Tuvalu, that could mean like all of the transactions could be, BSV based. Now, the thing that people have to think about, right, is that it's, again, because I was talking before about like corporates, thinking you just flip on a switch and then everybody's going to adopt everything.
Yeah.
Same problem here, same risk, right? Because it's not just about like rolling this out to everybody and like everyone's using it. You have behavior change issues. You also have political issues. Tuvalu also uses the Australian dollar, right? They have to ship that in physically from Australia whenever they need to replenish.
Oh, so they actually use physical used to mint, Australian cash for their currency. Yes. Right.
Correct. So I think it's just a legacy thing, right? Yeah. So I think they could have their own Tuvaluan dollar, but I just don't think they've seen the benefit of it in terms of a global, being globally competitive sense. Now, it does change if the Tuvaluan dollar does happen to be minted on top of something like Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
It does give them a new, I guess, option, right, that they might not have thought about before.
Yeah, it is an extra hurdle you face if you're looking at things like, digitizing the banking system or perhaps running a national fiat currency running tokenized on the blockchain. If they're already using another nation's currency as their official currency or unofficial currency, that is going to be a bit of a hurdle, I think. So,
yes, politically, right? Because, they have partnerships with Australia, New Zealand, many other countries. So it's not just about like, oh, hey, we'll just now use the Tuvaluan dollar. It's like, well, if we do that, will that have any political ramifications?
Mm-hmm.
So this is where, even though people might see, Tuvalu with a small population, again, I urge people to look up EEZs and realize that it's a lot more than just the population. Places like Tuvalu and some of these other Pacific nations actually hold a lot of power in other ways. One part that people might not have thought about is actually space territory above the South Pacific. The Pacific Ocean, right, if you look at it, is a large part of Earth that when it comes to sort of space above, there are a whole bunch of space treaties and agreements that other countries need to sort out in order to be able to fly over or do anything.
Interesting, yeah. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about exclusive economic zones or EEZs, then being isolated and being an archipelago in the middle of the Pacific Ocean can actually work to your advantage for once.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're a smaller country, say like Belgium or Netherlands, or and you're in the middle of a densely populated continent, then it's not so great.
Yep, exactly. I mean, I think this is the difference, right? For me personally, I've always been very fascinated by looking at sort of opportunities where no one's looking, right? It's probably how I got involved with Bitcoin in the early days. Thanks to some individuals in the space who helped introduce me to it. But also looking at, okay, well, if there are these, areas that or products or projects that people kind of undervalue, how can you take what is a perceived weakness and turn it into a strength? It's one of the reasons why I moved to Singapore, because Singapore's history is actually very reflective of that. They were essentially casted out of Malaysia. They were very dependent on Malaysia once upon a time, but then a guy by the name of Lee Kuan Yew, his story is very fascinating. He was able to turn that country from essentially, third world. I know that's not politically correct these days, but it is what it is. But turned it from third world country into a first within 50 years, which is unheard of, or at least was unheard of until Singapore was able to do it. There are many examples too of where you have small nations who end up punching way above their weight and doing a lot. A lot of these emerging nations, right? Emerging markets. Great Britain, right, was an island nation that managed to colonize like most of the world. You could look at Mongolia, right? A bunch of illiterate nomads who managed to end up taking over like half of the world in terms of landmass. There are many examples of small players who end up having a huge impact in the end. And I think Tuvalu and many in the Pacific region actually have that type of opportunity, or at least that's how I see it. And looking to see how we can sort of support that. First, by addressing some very real issues for them, which is, things like rising ocean levels and whatnot. And I think that needs to be resolved through economic means so that they also don't find themselves playing debt politics with other superpowers. Because it's like, again, like how Simon Kofe rejected 400 million from China. If he had taken that on, he might have damned his, like the Tuvaluan people forever, right? By taking that from China.
Yeah, who knows really? I mean, the sands are shifting all the time there, literally and metaphorically. But
yes. Yep.
Okay, so we have an archipelago. We have how many islands are there? With a significant population?
8 to 9.
Okay.
Eight.
Not a huge amount. It's not Indonesia or anything like that. So it's less of a
challenge.
No. What kind of hardware upgrades or improvements need to be done? So I guess wireless technologies would figure prominently there.
Yep. So as mentioned, they do already have 3G networks, but they're upgrading to 4G slash 5G at the moment. And I'll confirm on the 5G. I'm definitely showing the 4G, but they're obviously upgrading enough so that people can have at least this level of connection, via video streaming services, etc. So far, we've been doing Zoom meetings with the Tuvalu government. For the most part, it's been pretty good, and I think that's because they've ensured that they have fast internet connection at the Tuvalu government buildings. But obviously not the same everywhere.
Of course.
The other issue is that because of their remoteness, the price for internet, I believe, this is based on what I've heard from my families, is quite high. So I think with the infrastructure upgrades, that should help, lower the price a bit. But again, these are some of the very real realities they have from a digital infrastructure standpoint.
So is your project going to be involved with the hardware upgrades in any way, or is that something they have to do independently?
I think that's something that they will be focused on, but I think the sky's the limit. So we've come in, of course, with a focus on the BSV side, the blockchain aspect, and we'll stay in our lane. But as we get more involved, we do see other opportunities for us to help work with the Tuvalu government. But again, they have other projects that they're doing at the same time, and so we respect what's happening. But of course, we can provide at least some of these digital infrastructure support through these means for now. But there's a lot of opportunity, but of course, you always have to prioritize.
As you said before, culture is really important, and it's I think particularly important in this case too, when you have like your outsiders and semi-outsiders coming in and telling a country how to develop their digital infrastructure and record-keeping platforms. You yourself have Tuvaluan heritage, as you said, and that's and you also said that it was them who approached you first, not the other way around. I think that's probably a key point that that we need to remind people of sometimes too. Have you encountered so far any resistance or pushback to your plans?
Of course, I think there are some people who have asked, when they dig into the technology side, of course, as you would know, like why BSV? That's one that obviously would come up.
That's a question we answer every day.
Because what's popular is of course BTC, Ethereum, etc. But luckily, again, this is why I spent a lot of time educating the minister about why. And because he is also somebody that is that I consider to be a person of integrity. He cared more about the technology side of things, right? Than sort of what's popular and like what the price is and whatnot. Now, of course, you can't ignore that. People are always going to hear like, oh, the price of Bitcoin. But the way we described it was plumbing system, right? And we want to provide a very strong financial plumbing system, right? And reminding them that with Bitcoin, it was about micropayments, and BTC cannot do the micropayments anymore if it continues to have more and more people get onto the network, as we're seeing. Yeah. Same thing goes for Ethereum, so this was sort of our key focus or emphasis, as we were talking, and as I started speaking to more in the Tuvalu government, explaining that to them, why that's important. Because again, when you're dealing with these type of countries, right, you also want to provide them with something that will last, because they are remote, and you don't want to be providing something that, will just break on its head. And I have unfortunately seen many foreigners do this to the South Pacific, where they come in and, as you said, say this is how you should do things and do this, do that, and then just leave and they're forgotten. For me, that's not the case. This is very personal for me, right? This is something that is tied to my heritage, right? It's also reflective of my family's. Mm-hmm. And so I would not recommend something that I also did not feel confident about for the long term, because that's what matters to me.
At the very least, you're definitely not going to forget about it.
No, exactly. This is not a project whereby we just go in, get out, and then that's done. Mm-hmm. Because it's one thing you'll learn about countries like Tuvalu, we're very community oriented, right? Yeah. And so that's why it's important that as we're doing this, one of the things that FAIA plays a role in is sort of translating some of these cultural nuances as we're engaging. So N-Chain and ELAS are also involved, but of course, they're coming from a technology standpoint. FAIA plays a role in being able to translate that, so that they're understanding, when they're either doing interviews or they're doing prototypes or that sort of stuff, that they are capturing the nuances of how things will be received on the Tuvaluan side. And then also for later on, when it comes time to roll out the change management, that's something that we specialize in as well. So that's sort of where we fit. So we're getting the technology expertise, but then coupled with our understanding of the people side.
Excellent. That's probably a good point to wrap it up there, George. And I think people are going to want to find out more about this. I definitely want you to come back and give us updates as it progresses. I think some people ask too
Definitely.
if there was any way they could get involved or to help with the project at all. Are you looking for people now, or are you just still at the exploratory stages?
I mean, look, anybody who's interested in getting involved, like, feel free to reach out. Anyways,
Mm-hmm.
probably the easiest way is just to go to our website, www.firecorp.com. There's a contact thing there, or just hit me up on Twitter. That's fine as well. Now, of course, because there's a lot of moving parts, we can start the conversations now, but I think things will start to pick up, later on in the year. Again, this is sort of a multi-year project. And
As it
yeah,
should be.
this is something that we're building for the long term.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating project, George, and probably, if you ask me, I think it's one of the most compelling projects in Bitcoin happening at the moment too, just because of the scope and the potential
Yeah.
for it.
Yep.
It could be a great demonstration. All right,
Exactly. Yeah.
great. Thanks a lot, George, and thanks for coming on the show. And we'll see you again next time you come on.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.